There you go. Welcome, 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 one and all. We'll start in a minute. There's more people joining us. And so we are looking forward to seeing you and having you and hosting you here. We have guests who are coming from both the United States and in Israel. Situation a bit tricky there. So we'll try to, or we're keeping our fingers that nothing will happen. But obviously, if a siren starts somewhere in Israel, we will have to maneuver and try to improvise on the fly. The speaker's security and safety obviously is most important, the most important part here. But it is great to see some familiar names. I see the list. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. More people would come into this event as it starts, but we'll start in a moment. I'm just trying to see some of the familiar names. Oh yeah, absolutely. Just keep in mind, we are recording this event. Let's give it another minute and then start the show. But in any case, thank you so much for joining us today. All righty. First of all, as I said, we are recording this event. So thank you. Be mindful of that. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'd like to express my gratitude to Avis Koiman and Rongrong Zhang for all their assistance behind the scenes that makes this and all other events possible. I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today for the online event titled Faith, Power, and Social Change, Jewish Religiosity in Contemporary Israel, featuring an excellent lineup of speakers that I'll introduce in a moment. I would like to mention and take advantage of this opportunity and mention that our next event is the inauguration of the Gildenhorn Family Lecture Series that will take place on Tuesday, March 24th at 7 p.m. at the Clarice Smith Performing Arts Center on campus. This is an in-person event, finally, featuring Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and senior official in the Biden and Obama administrations, who will talk about timely and important U.S.-Israel relations in a changing Middle East. For more information and to register to these and all other events, please visit www.israelstudies.und.edu. Now, it's a pleasure to open tonight's program, Faith, Power, and Social Change, Jewish Religiosity in Contemporary Israel. This title, I would argue, captures, in a few words, some of the most dynamic and consequential forces shaping Israeli society today. While the global as well as the domestic attention in Israel is naturally focused on the war waged by the United States and Israel against Iran, I would like to argue that today's topic relates to a no less consequential aspect of the future of the state of Israel. Not security in the classical sense, but perhaps something just as important. From its founding in 1948, Israel has been a state that is both profoundly modern, but also deeply rooted in religious tradition. Religious ideas are not only confined to synagogues or seminaries, they shape legislation, military service debates, educational policies, questions of identity, and the very definition of what it means to be a Jewish and democratic state. In recent years, especially following the emergence of political polarization in Israel and the trauma and upheaval since October 7th, 2023, religious language, symbols, and institutions have played an increasingly visible role in both mobilizing and contesting power. And what triggered me, perhaps more than before, to think about this event and organizing it is a report about a survey conducted in July 2025 that found that 78% of Israeli citizens, both Jewish and Arab, believe in God. And that nearly 70% of the respondents reported that God has an important role, in their lives. So I hope that today's conversation will allow us to think analytically about these developments. How does religiosity reshape political alignments? How does state power transform religious communities, perhaps? and how do ordinary Israelis experience the intersection of belief and citizenship in their daily lives. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speakers who will try to address these and possibly other questions, each from their own professional and personal vantage point. You can find their full bios on our website, but just in a very brief way, I would like to introduce Shmuel Rosner, who's a Tel Aviv-based researcher, columnist, and editor. He's a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, JPPI, the founder and editor of the data journalism and research initiative, themadad.com, and the founder and editor of the books and ideas initiatives, The Hedgehog and the Fox. He writes a weekly column for the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles and for Ma'ariv in Israel. Dr. Gila Stopler is a professor of law and former dean of the law school at the College of Law and Business. She's the head of the Human Rights Division and the head of the Master's Program in Law and Society, and serves as editor-in-chief of the journal Law and Ethics of Human Rights. Her expertise includes constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, religion, state relations, multiculturalism, women's rights, human rights, populism, and democratic erosion. Dr. Alice Weinreb is a research director at the Taub Center and an expert in demography. Until 2019, he was a professor in the Department of Sociology and the founder of the Health and Society undergraduate major at the University of Texas at Austin. Before he's moved to Austin, he was a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. As for the format of today's event, each speaker will start with a 10-minute kind of expose, trying to offer their opening remarks, and then we'll move to a more conversational kind of setting among the three panelists, and hopefully with the assistance of the audience, to some Q&As. So please type your questions in the designated chat box if you wish, or when we transition to the Q&A section, just raise your hand when we do that. Let's start with the first panelist, and we go by alphabetical order. So Shmuel Rosner, you are first, my friend. The floor is yours.
It's very rare for me to go first when people go by alphabetic order. But thank you for having me, and thank you all for participating in this event. I'll offer some notes on Israeli traditionality and religiosity, and I think it's important to note that Israel is a very traditional society, by which I don't necessarily mean that it's a very religious society. Israel is very traditional. It is also, in many ways, very liberal in its outlook on issues that in the United States would be considered part of the religiosity arena. So when we speak about things such as rights for homosexuals or other issues that tend to be controversial in other countries and connected to religiosity, in Israel, they don't quite fit into the same category. What we see in Israel, by and large, is more traditionality than religiosity. It is people highly connected to this sense of their country being a country in which tradition, and by this I mean, of course, for the 80% majority Jews, Jewish tradition, they consider it part of the national ethos. Their Jewishness is not necessarily a tradition that they treat as if they are religious people who have certain beliefs and practice all the many traditions. They look at their Jewishness in some way as part of the national identity of their society. Again, this is true for the majority population of Jews. Arabs in Israel are traditional in a way more similar to traditionality in Arab countries outside of Israel or alongside Israel, somewhat like the Palestinians in the West Bank or Jordanians or other versions of Arab traditionality in our region that resembles the traditionality of Arab Israelis. By and large, if we look at Israeli society, There is about 30% of Jews who are highly traditional, whom we call religious people. These are people who practice all the commandments. They observe the Shabbat. They would not drive on Shabbat. They will do other things. These are people that are very different in many ways, both politically and socially, from other Israelis. They have many specific characteristics. And within them, you see two main camps: the camp of the Zionist religious people, who tend to be more integrated into modern society, but still have very strong political, right-wing political tendencies, conservative political tendencies. And we have the ultra-Orthodox community. The ultra-Orthodox community is important for two main reasons. A, because it's not well integrated into the rest of our society, and B, because it's the fastest growing group in Israel. In fact, when you look at projections for Israel's future, and I'm sure Alex is going to talk about such issues later, there are projections that put the ultra-Orthodox community at close to 30%, even above 30% within a couple of decades. I just published a book on the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel and the challenge it poses to Israel in the worst possible time to publish such book, because all eyes are on Iran and people tend to think only about external security issues and not about internal challenges. And I'd say that one of the things that we need to understand about Israeli religiosity and the challenges it posed to Israel's future is the fact that there's always something more urgent for Israel than to deal with religiosity as a challenge. Whenever we say, okay, now we have to turn to look at this or that issue and deal with it, people would say, well, first we must deal with Iran or with Gaza or with terrorism or with some economic crisis or a pandemic. There's always something that seems more urgent than these internal dynamics that change Israel gradually but very slowly. And that's one of the reasons for which Israel is not really equipped or not really ready to deal in a productive way with these issues. I'll just say that during the war, the war is changing Israeli society, and we are still in the midst of war after 4 very stormy years, 1 year of political, social upheaval because of the so-called judicial reform, and then the massacre of October 7th and its aftermath, 2.5 years of war. So this is still an ongoing process that will probably have impact on Israeli identity and society. Polling Israelis during these months, and we did it a couple of times, we do see some changes that are worthy of note. One is that most Israelis tend to say that they became more traditional because of the current situation. The crisis makes them more traditional. They tend to observe more, perform more of the ceremonies or the traditions that are part of the Jewish calendar or Jewish commandments. They don't become religious. It's not as if these traditional Israelis are becoming fully religious, but they would emphasize their Jewishness in a more pronounced way. They will speak about this more in a more profound way. So most of us are becoming more traditional, but we are also becoming somewhat more polarized, because the very secular Israelis, the faction within Israel of secular Jewish Israelis, is becoming more alienated from Jewish tradition. This is mostly for political reasons, because tradition and religion are highly associated with the current coalition, and most non-religious people, secular people, are in opposition to the current coalition. This creates a rift that impacts not only political views, but also the way Israelis view their tradition and treat the tradition and describe their own identity. I think my 10 minutes are almost up, so I'll end here, and I'm happy to answer any question if there's any later in our conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shmuel. You kind of provided a lot to think about and kind of lay up for the other speakers. Gila Stopler is next. How do you see this conversation? How do you see this title and some of these themes that Shmuel, or perhaps I thought about when I read this survey? How do you see that?
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm going to speak more legally to the point because I'm a legal scholar, and perhaps, you know, in a more pessimistic tone than Shmuel's. So last week, the Knesset passed in a preliminary reading a bill that would criminalize egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall by making any behavior that's in violation of the chief rabbinate's rulings punishable by up to 7 years in prison. 2 weeks ago, a bill expanding the power of rabbinical courts to rule on civil matters that are usually under the exclusive jurisdiction of civil courts was approved by the Knesset Constitution Committee and will soon be brought for its final readings in the Knesset's plenum. Several weeks ago, a bill entitled The Realization of Jewish Identity in the Public Sphere was passed in a preliminary reading. This bill will make it a criminal offense to disrupt any expression of Orthodox Jewish prayer or act as defined by the chief rabbinate in the public sphere. One result would be that if a group, for example, if a group of Orthodox men decide to pray in the middle of a public square in Tel Aviv and bar women from passing through the square during their prayer, they'll be entitled to do so legally. According to the law, any woman who will try to pass through the square will face criminal charges. Any city official who will try to help her will be dismissed from their job and face fines and criminal charges. So in my short talk, I want to make 5 remarks addressing the increasing theocratization of Israel, its impact on women's rights and on religious freedom, and its connection to Netanyahu government's regime revolution. So my first point is that it's important to put the current theocratization in historical context. In certain aspects, especially in the matter of personal status, the state of Israel from its inception has sacrificed basic rights, especially women's rights and the right to religious freedom, on the altar of political considerations to gain the support of patriarchal conservative religious leaders. For example, with respect to women's rights, alongside considerable achievements in the struggle for women's equality in Israel over the years, still islands of extreme inequality have persisted under the auspices of law. Women's rights have been routinely violated due to their subordination to patriarchal religious legal systems in matters of marriage and divorce. Religious courts that are staffed by men only have been denying women basic freedoms for years. This perpetual entrenchment of the most conservative and patriarchal version of the Jewish religion in the state constitutes a convenient springboard for expanding the sphere of control of patriarchal religions, and especially the control of the politically powerful Jewish ultra-conservative orthodoxy over the Jewish population. My second point is that the current government coalition includes the most conservative Jewish religious elements, which Shmuel mentioned, including the ultra-Orthodox or Haredim, and among the religious Zionism, the most extreme sect within religious Zionism, which are known as Hardalim. And these have unprecedented power in government due to Netanyahu's determination to maintain his government at all costs to escape his criminal charges. As a result, the current coalition enables extremist religious views and the rabbis that dictate them to take over many aspects of the state authority that directly impact the rights of all Jewish citizens. I already mentioned the 3 bills aimed at expanding religious control. Another bill that's advancing through the legislative process expands gender segregation in academia. This segregation started out as allegedly a temporary measure in undergraduate degrees, open only to ultra-Orthodox population, allegedly needed to encourage ultra-Orthodox to enter academic studies. Now it is being expanded to master's and doctorate degrees, opened to whoever wants segregated academic studies, all in contravention of the ruling of the Supreme Court and against the position of the Council for Higher Education. This bill is only a part of a much broader movement to expand the exclusion of women from the public sphere, which was agreed upon in the coalition agreement and is being implemented. Among other things, these agreements stipulate that the law prohibiting discrimination in products and services would be amended to protect private businesses that refuse to provide services and products due to religious belief. The amending bill would allow service providers to enforce segregation between men and women, to require women to dress modestly as a condition for being provided a service, and even to restrict women's entry into services and to designated hours. If it's passed, the law would allow service providers to refuse to provide service to Arabs, to members of the gay community, all based on this alleged religious belief. And moreover, they may also refuse to sell a product or provide a service, even based solely on what they perceive to be the religious preferences of their customers. The third point I want to make is that many Israelis are indifferent to the increased theocratization. I'm continuing Shmuel's point about that there are more important things. So they're indifferent or they're simply ignorant of its meaning or consequences. There are several reasons for this. One is simply the misunderstanding by liberals of what the theocratization process is and what are its goals. Another may be this increase that Shmuel has discussed in the number of Israelis who feel closer to religion following October 7. A third reason, which is related to this increase, is the unprecedented government budgets spent to bring Jewish Israelis closer to a very specific kind of religion, the most ultra-conservative Jewish orthodoxy, and depict this orthodoxy as the only legitimate option for an Israeli Jew in these times of war and crisis. For example, the 2025 budget alone, over 500 million shekels were allocated to various projects for what the government calls strengthening Jewish identity. This identity obviously interpreted by the ultra-conservative religious coalition parties that control all these budgets. My fourth point is to give one example of how deep the misunderstanding of many Israelis is for what really is going on. This example is the reaction by many secular Jews to the feminist critique of expanding the gender segregation in the public sphere. Many seculars reject this critique, claiming that it fails to recognize the supposed cultural right of the Haredim and the Hardalim and to have their own segregated lifestyle. And also claiming that this segregation doesn't really violate the rights of religious women because they allegedly want the segregation, and of secular women because they allegedly do not have to be present in the segregated spaces. However, the profound error in this argument and the true severity of women's exclusion in Israel today and the takeover of patriarchal and discriminatory perceptions is revealed if we look at the senior government echelon in Israel in the present government. So at this echelon, the transition to patriarchal rule exclusively by men has already taken place, as government ministers insist on appointing only men to senior positions in the public sphere, in the public service, contrary to explicit law. even after a petition was filed by the Israeli Women's Network to the Supreme Court against the government for violating the law on adequate representation. The court accepted this petition, ruled against the government. The government still continues to ignore both the law and the court ruling and appoint only male director generals to government offices. As of the end of 2025, not one single woman has served as director general in any of the 31 government ministries. While in the previous government, headed by Bennett and Lapid, 41% of director generals of the government ministries were women. In Netanyahu's current government, 0% are women. My fifth and last point is that this reality and all the examples that I discussed are an important part of an overall regime change pushed for by Netanyahu and his right-wing nationalist and religious government. This change aims to dismantle the remaining aspects of the liberal democratic system of government in Israel and to establish in its stead what I call a patrimonial regime. The transition to a patrimonial regime involves moving from a liberal democratic regime where legality is the prime source of authority to a patrimonial regime where tradition, both religious and patriarchal, becomes the main source of authority, and legality is subordinated to the power of the patrimonial ruler. Among other things, a patrimonial regime involves controlling the courts, promoting religious nationalism, attacking the hallmarks of liberal culture, such as minority rights, equality, secularism, with a special emphasis on returning to traditional gender roles and restricting the rights and the autonomy of women. All of these things we see happening today in Israel, and they're all connected to each other. And as I try to briefly show, the processes of the patrimonialization and theocratization of Israel are progressing, and their consequences for human rights and for religious freedom are dire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gila Stopler. Very dark, very ominous in that sense. Alex Weinreb perhaps will provide us some quantitative data, or perhaps his outlook as a demographer, perhaps, I don't know what he's going to say, trying to explain kind of the long and short of it. What does the future look like?
No, that's what I'm supposed to do? Should have told me earlier.
No, as you wish. We allow maximum.
So I'm going to try. Well, so I'm not going to be quite as dark. I'm quite as dark as Gila. I think it would be hard to be. But what I'm going to try to do, I think, is provide a somewhat long view on some of these things, and where I can, I'm going to intersect with points raised by both Shmuel and with Gila. So the first thing is just a question of measurement, and that's where the social scientist in me comes in. I mean, when we talk about a society becoming more religious over time, it can do it in three ways, right? The first is there's a compositional shift in the population. So you have let's say three groups which comprise the population, and they're growing at different speeds, because in one group they have many more births than in the other. So over time, assuming all those people who are born stay in that group, so there's going to be a shift in the composition, and the society will change. That's the first way. The second way is that individuals, like within the life course, become more religious. Right, so somebody is born in Israel secular, and then they start for search for meaning, and then they say, okay, I'm going to become more more traditional, in the sense that Shmuel was talking about. Somebody start to take on practices which he didn't grow up with. So over time, again, things change. The third method is that society becomes more tolerant of showing symbols which are associated with religion, and I think when if I'm looking at what's going on in Israel over the last decades, I would say that all three of these things are happening at the same time. But I think there's some confusion about the relative weight of each of these things. So here, the big thing which everybody talks about is the fact that I mean, as Shmuel said, the fastest growing subpopulation in Israel is the Haredi population, is the ultra-Orthodox population, and that stems basically from the fact that the average number of children born to a Haredi woman is around 6, whereas for a secular woman it's around 2. For a religious woman it's 3 to 3.5. So over time, if you just think about the math, okay, well, it's very, very clear what's going to happen long term. So the projections that Shmuel was talking about are based simply on that. The problem in those projections is that they do not take into account the second factor, which is that over time people make changes in their religiosity. And it turns out that when you follow people across time in Israel, there is considerable net movement. There are more people leaving the Haredi world and joining it, and there are more people leaving the national religious world than joining it. So over time, even though there is higher fertility in those two populations, there's a net shift towards the secular population. So some of the compositional shifts are basically being mitigated by the fact that there are more people leaving and becoming quote unquote secular or more secular than they were. This doesn't mean that Israel is not compositionally becoming more religious. It is, but it's just not happening as fast as the projections of the Central Bureau of Statistics. And the reason there is because the Central Bureau of Statistics assumes that there is no movement at all. There is no Central Bureau of Statistics in the world except for Israel, which does projections based on religiosity, because there is no established method for doing it. It basically defies the rules in population science, where you have to define a closed population. This is not a closed population because there is movement. So there's a basic flaw in the data which everybody uses to show that by 2050 it's not going to be 30% or 35%. It's going to be less. It'll still be more than it is today, but it'll be less. All right. So that's one thing, like a simple data thing. But now more thematic things I think are also really important. Part of what's going on here, when we look at the increasing use of symbols which we associate with religion, is basically a decentering of older Ashkenazi secular elites. They used to run everything, and including all institutions. All the dominant national symbols were theirs. And it doesn't matter what area you look at music or cinema or even literature, they have been displaced or they are being displaced. So one of my favorite examples is to look at singers. And if you think of, like Einstein and Mati Kaspi and Gidi Gov and all these guys, they all grew up secular. None of them served in a combat unit. They were all in the army entertainment troupe. Whereas now the people who are leading the charge, so Per Tassi, Idan Ahmedi, Amir Dadon, guys like that, they all came up, went through combat units. They're all much more involved in the basic Jewish rituals. They're much more connected to it, and they've been much more exposed to people from across the swathe of Israeli society. And that's naturally reflected in their music, and it's naturally reflected in their popularity. But they, in the 1960s and 70s, they wouldn't have made it, because the mechanism for creating the musical and the and the cultural elites was exactly parallel to what we think of today with Unit 8200. Like the way you get into high tech in Israel is in the army, you serve in 8200. The way you used to get into the musical and cultural elite in Israel was through the army entertainment corps. So basically, there's a displacement which is going on, and part of what we see when we say, "Oh, Israeli society is becoming more religious in terms of these commonly circulating symbols," is simply the fact that it's a displacement of old Ashkenazi elites. I have time for one more point, which I'm going to make. Then obviously others can come up in conversation. And this ties back into something which both Gila and Shmuel were talking about, which is the segregation issue. When people come and ask me about Israel demographically, because we're really weird. We're growing at over the last 30 to 40 years at 2% per year or 1.9% per year, very, very unusual. But there's another aspect of population policy in Israel which is very, very odd by Western standards, and that's simply the fact that we allow different subpopulations to have their own buildings, neighborhoods, villages, towns, and then we allow those people to educate their children at public expense in school networks which are associated just with those populations. So there is not a single public school system in Israel. There are four, and each of those has subtypes. So what we're doing is creating a society where there is no contact, not residentially, and not in terms of school, and then the two subpopulations which most need to be integrated into Israeli society, the Arab population and the Haredi population, don't even serve in the army, which is the single organization which could most successfully integrate them. So the Israeli population policy planning is built around the idea of segregation. So when I listen to Gila talking about gender there, then like to me that's just a secondary artifact basically of a wider policy which allows for segregation. And I mean, obviously, in terms of long-term planning, if you want to talk about having an integrated society, we're shooting ourselves in the foot with this. I mean, I'm going to leave you one final sentence. I mean, as they like to say in Hebrew, just one sentence, and then they say 5 or 6, but here it really is one sentence. People historically embraced religion and religious symbols during times of crisis. All right, it's a known thing. We have lived through several years of a more intense crisis, from epidemic through political instability and wars, but that in itself followed on a long trail of other, long political instability. So it makes sense to me that there would be some embrace of religious symbols, especially in Jewish religion, because it's provides such a rich body of material on which people can draw for meaning. I'm going to leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex Weinreb. We're going to open the floor for a conversation. So people in the audience, feel free to type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen or raise your hand. But as a despot, as a dictator that I am, I'd like to pose a couple of questions just to start steering this conversation. Shmuel, you published a book back in 2019 that talks about Israeli Judaism. Now, I'm pretty bad in math, I apologize, Alex, but it's about 6-7 years or so. Has it aligned, has it fulfilled your expectation in that sense, or has it taken a turn completely different that you didn't see or you didn't think about when you wrote the book?
Well, in some ways it did, and in some ways it was probably too optimistic. My co-author, the late Professor Camille Fuchs, and I, we did not see the political and social upheaval of starting in 2019 or so and continuing up until today. We didn't see it coming in such a way, and I assume that had we decided to rewrite the book today, it would present a more nuanced analysis of this intersection of politics and religiosity, which we did not do in the book. Our chapter on the ultra-Orthodox is also much more optimistic than the book I just wrote on the ultra-Orthodox community. In the book itself, I refer to my previous book and I say, I was also of the camp of people who thought that this problem will in some way resolve itself. I thought that we were already seeing a process of faster integration of the ultra-Orthodox society into the larger modern Israeli society, and that was a projection that was too optimistic at the time. So again, the main feature saying that Israel is a country that combines modern a modern secular civil state with an ancient tradition and creates a new culture, the culture that we call Israeli Judaism. I think this analysis still stands, but there are caveats and there are reasons to worry. I'm not as worried as Gila is, but I don't want to deny the many challenges that we face. And adding to Alex, Alex said, and rightly so, that demographic projections are always problematic. Demographic projections can be wrong in both ways. So the process that is currently described by the Bureau of Statistics can be slower or faster than what we think today. I think there are reasons to suspect that it could be slower, but there are also reasons to suspect that it could be faster.
Alrighty, so this is a very good start. And again, both speakers pointed to Gila's kind of dark and bleak outlook. So Gila, to you, my question is as follows. What models, comparative or theoretical, perhaps can help Israel better navigate the tension between collective religious identity that is emerging one way or another, whether we take Shmuel Rosner's approach or something else, kind of Alex's, and individual civil rights. You spoke about women's rights and other groups in Israeli society, Arabs or not Jews, and so on and so on. What can we do? What can be done practically, actionably?
Well, what can be done is what should have been done many, many years ago, but has not been done because of political convenience, which is, a much deeper education for democratic and liberal values, for equality. The Haredi community has no civic education whatsoever, not to mention, they don't have civic education. They don't even have, the core curriculum. Which is which is something that, to my mind, is a dire violation of the rights of Haredi children, and not just to my mind, to the mind of any Haredi who has dared to take the almost impossible step of coming outside of the Haredi community with no education whatsoever. So there are things that can be done, but these things that can be done are politically simply, unrealistic. They have not occurred when, when the political situation was much more amenable to it. So they will not. I can't see how they will happen today. So this is why I think the whole there's you talk about demography, but more than talking about demography, I'm a feminist scholar. So feminists always talk about power. The question is not demographic. The question is, where is the power? And today the power obviously is in the hands of what is, it's a minority government, even though it's even though it has 68 seats out of 120 in parliament. It is by any according to any poll, it's a minority government. But the problem is that this shift of power back to people who would, change the course of Israel today would be, I don't know. I'm afraid that I don't see it happening very quickly, and not just because of Israel. It's a world movement. I mean, you have the same problem in the United States. You have the same problem of populism and polarization in other countries in the world. Even though I think Israel and the United States are, the most obvious examples of the problem that undemocratic forces are in power, and separating them from that power would be extremely difficult.
Fantastic. This leads me to a question. You mentioned demography. So going back to Alex, just one question before we open the floor for everybody else, with your permission. You talked about kind of a reshifting or redrawing of the kind of the religious groups or the religious camps. Can you talk more about that? Are we talking about some kind of a consolidation, or is it more fragmentation? What is the trend saying about who's going to be the more dominant? If you say that ultra-Orthodox Jews have changed, or the degree of religiosity or the nature of their religiosity is changing, so what do we see? What should we expect to see, as opposed to the CBS's kind of quantitative data as such?
Okay, I think it's important to distinguish like a straightforward demographic projection from how from the way that's expressed politically, and one way one way you can think about that is if you look at the seats of the ultra-Orthodox parties in the Knesset over the last 30 years, they've hardly grown. They were in 1996, which is when Bibi was first elected. The ultra-Orthodox parties had 14 seats. Today they have 18. It's been 30 years of massive growth demographically in terms of voting, but those votes apparently are going elsewhere. So the way that their political power is being expressed, at least in the ballot box, is different, and that points to something which I think is very, very important. As the Haredi population has become larger, and I mean, Shmuel, I look forward to reading your book. I hope there's stuff like this in there. But I mean, as it's become larger, the schisms within it have grown. So you're seeing Haredi, like the emergence of new forms of being ultra-Orthodox. Which is, and some people are associating it with the increasingly dominant role of women within the Haredi world, meaning not in the formal political structure, but in the economic power within communities and inside households. So there's a shift, for example, going on within the Haredi world, where the women are no longer just being teachers, but they're going into tech. And with that means that their labor income is going to be higher. The community will become even more dependent on them. So even if formal political power is in the Haredi world completely dominated by men, the informal power, what's happening behind the scenes, I'm less sure of. And I think that's an important factor. It certainly shapes what we're starting to see in terms of falling fertility inside the Haredi world, in changing consumption patterns, which I've seen for sure, more fancy cars, more holidays, more things like this. So that's one side. I think the more important thing, and I'm gonna lean back into a point which Shmuel made, is that the war has caused, I think, a very important schism or splintering between the national religious and the Haredi world. I think for a long time there was some conformity, where the national religious basically let the Haredi world do what they did, and it wasn't great. It wasn't ideal, but fundamentally they were on the right side. In the current war, because there's been so much, some really nasty comments from leading Haredi Ravs about the National Religious. So there's growing opposition, and it's not quiet anymore. It's out loud. So I'm curious to see what happens in the long term politically because of this. And if I can make a final point, it's when we look at Israel, we have to. I think. Israel. I'm not sure that the default is a Western style liberal society. Israel is not that. It never has been that. I think there are aspirations for it to be like that in certain sectors, but certainly in terms of family structure, we are not Western Europe. We are not North America. More than 90% of births in Israel are born inside marriage. The average in Europe is about 45%, the same as it is in North America. There are traditional structures in Israeli society which mark it as much more Asian, much more Middle Eastern, and that's true. That's true across the board. It's not only the Mizrahi population; it's also the Israeli Ashkenazi population. So I'm not sure to what extent our legal structures should reflect what's going on in Europe. I'm not sure that's our normative reference point.
Very provocative statement, and I think that Gila would like to respond to that, but we'll allow some people from the audience. I see that Larry Wolf raised his hand multiple times. Larry Wolf is very interested, and he came back from Israel just a couple of months ago, very interested in these topics. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah. Also, hello, Shmuel. I've known Shmuel for, 20, 30 years, so nice to see you. I have three particular comments. One is, since I'm involved with the reform movement in Israel, there was a study, I'm sure you've read, done by the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, which looked at attitudes of Jews to various to the reform movement. And one striking element to me was that secular people are like 50% of Israel, but 57% of Israeli seculars support the concept of Reform Judaism. Only 6% self-identify as Reform, but 57% of secular Jews support what they do. And this is an enormous change, and it will lead to a different set of roles and commitments by the secular community. There's a joke that said that the secular Jews are Reform, but they don't know it. Well, now they seem to know it. So that's the first point. The second one is after I spoke to someone named Nechami Yaffe, who was an extraordinary professor, a Haredi woman with a PhD, and she said she discovered there were some striking changes in the Haredi community that in the past, only 4% of the Haredi students were attending the government organized schools, Haredi schools, which also taught the civic subjects, that the percent going to this school system jumped from 4% to 8% over 1 year. So there's a lot happening in the Haredi community that we have to be aware of. And the final point is the point made about the divided society. And I think that is one of the deepest and most important and difficult issues that Israel faces. And we have to find a way to bring these four groups or four tribes together through the education system.
Thank you so much, Larry. Shmuel, do you want to take the point about Reform Judaism? Can you talk about the landscape in Israel, and to what extent is this something that is changing, perhaps evolving dramatically?
Well, I'd hate to disappoint my friend Larry, but on the issue of the reform movement, the numbers he cites are correct, and we saw them in previous studies as well. But I think most secular Jews who profess their support for Reform Judaism are making a political statement more than a statement about religiosity or tradition or the way they think Judaism should be performed. Of course, they'll say they prefer a synagogue with mixed sittings and egalitarian services, etc. But these are mostly people who don't attend the synagogue and hardly need any religious services. And their support of Reform Judaism is, by and large, an attempt to say, well, we associate Orthodox Judaism with the political factions that we dislike, and hence we will support whatever faction that opposes the Orthodox community and the Orthodox establishment and the Orthodox power grab, because Gila is right about that. Many of these things are about having power, and the Orthodox community is much better at having power for itself than the very small Reform community. So, I'd be happy to see thriving Reform communities in Israel, and there are some, but I don't think that there is a prospect for seeing Reform Judaism becoming the official stream for a majority of Jewish Israelis. There are more secular Israelis than religious Israelis, so you'd assume, okay, if they all prefer Reform Judaism over Orthodoxy, why don't we see more Reform communities than Orthodox communities? Well, that's the answer. You support Reform as a counterweight to Orthodox power, and then you go about, you just do what you do as a non-religious Israeli Jew. It's a separate culture. It's not Reform Judaism. It's Israeli Judaism.
All righty, Gila, Alex made a comment about the evolving nature of ultra-Orthodox communities, perhaps trying to alleviate some of the concerns that you raised and say, basically, it's going to be okay because it's not the same kind of religion over time, if I'm able to summarize or to try to be slightly more pointed about that. How do you see things?
Well, I'll connect your question and the discussion before, Lawrence's point and Shmuel's comment. So I'll start with the story. I teach religion and state. This is one of the things that I teach, and I also, that's one of the things I research. And I've always been accustomed to the very disturbing fact that I was always the only secular in the room, in conferences, in discussions, when I talk to my students. Everybody, for a very long time, secular Jews in Israel thought, well, religion state just doesn't bother us. It doesn't concern us. It's not something which were let the Orthodox Jews, the ultra-Orthodox or whatever, argue among themselves, like the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists, who will be in the rabbinical courts. And this is completely contrary to, to our everyday lives, because every Jew in Israel, especially Jewish women, is directly impacted by religion, for example, in the rabbinical courts. So there's been one of the things that has, and that's very sad, because this is how the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists have gained more and more power, especially, in religion state. Simply, it's something that they've always controlled fully and exclusively. There was no giving them the political power over these things was like a sine qua non. There was no question that this is what's going to happen. A second problem is that they are the ones who are always the how do you say, Lashon Moznaim, the ones who
on the balance,
they are on the balance between a government who will be the prime minister and who will not, and that's because of the Arab tribe has always been taboo, and we see politically how Netanyahu is always playing on, ostracizing the Arabs, which makes the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists, now also the religious Zionists, but the ultra-Orthodox for many, many years, be the ones who always have the political power, regardless of, of their size. So the thing is that all these structures have not changed; they have only worsened, and all this power grab is something which has been going on for ages. And and as someone who has been warning that this is going to happen, and nobody was listening to me, now all of a sudden people are waking up and saying, "Wait, what's happening here? How did we get to this point?" So this is how we got to this point, and the question is how we can reverse this point, and this is a much trickier question. And Lawrence is optimistic because he says, look, many seculars identify with Reform Judaism, but they identify with Reform Judaism as saying, it's like I'm telling my students, listen, we have a religious administration that in Israel. Imagine this religious administration was run by the Reform movement. It would be a much better religious administration. So this is the type of identification, but it's not something which is going to change their the way they view things and the way they act, soon enough. Unfortunately, I think.
Alrighty, we have Alex who raised his hand. I think he wants to respond to something. I'd like to ask a question. Perhaps, Alex, you can address that if that fits what you wanted to say or not. We focused on ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. There's a question from the audience about religious Zionists, the Datim Leumim. Is there any fragmentation there? Or perhaps to tie it based on the question from the audience, can you talk about not necessarily more religious trends, but rather radicalization of pre-existing trends, if that makes any sense?
I'm sure. Is this a question to me or somebody else?
I thought that you can have some comment about that, given the data that you collect over the years. Yes, please.
So the data which we collect doesn't exactly match this, but I'll try and do my best with the data which we have. There is increasing breaking up of what were once more unified political groupings in the religious sphere in general. So that's true in the Haredi world. It's also true in the national religious. Gila already referred to the Chardal, the more extreme national religious. Many of whose schools are actually run by the Haredi system within the Ministry of Education. So there are many more liberal national religious who have distanced themselves from the parties associated with Smotrich and with Ben-Gvir, and so those guys are part of the more classic national religious community. What used to be the heart of Mafdal, which was now we think of them as good liberal religious Jews. So I think that's certainly happening, and if anything, the last few years are going to make it happen more. But that's been a trend already happening since the pullout from Gaza about 20 years ago. The thing which I want to say is Gila is certainly right that for a long time the most religious parties acted as this balancing, as the balancers. So they had disproportionate power. But I think one of the interesting counterweights to what's happening formally, politically, is what people are choosing to do in their individual behavior. And here I'm going to come back to Larry Wolf's point. There is more openness to more alternative sorts of Jewish practice and identity. There's a community in my neighborhood, which is a borderline Haredi neighborhood. There's a Reform community here, and it's open and it's growing. So people are voting with their feet. My daughter, my eldest daughter is 25, just got married in September, and she had a religious ceremony, but she chose not to do it through the Rabbanut. So she had a separate civil marriage in Cyprus. According to the state, she got married in Cyprus, but she has a ketubah from a religious ceremony. And I mean, she knows more people who've done that. So I think there are more and more people who even though they're connected to Judaism, to Jewish practice, to Jewish identity, they are so alienated by the takeover of the Rabbanut, by the Haredi world in particular, and as much as they're welcoming for the alternative national religious sort of affiliated group of rabbis associated with a movement called Tzohar, as much as they're attracted to that, they want to make a more emphatic statement. It's like we're taking ourselves in these matters of personal status and personal transition. We're taking ourselves out of the mainstream entirely. We're going to just do it civilly. I think as more and more people do that, then it starts to shift things in the long term. It's not a top-down change, through legislation or through precedent in courts of law, but it is a change which is bubbling up from the bottom. And long term, I think that's super important.
This is very good. We're almost about to be done with this event today, but I'd like to allow the speakers to have kind of a lightning round of final thoughts. Shmuel will start, Gila, and then we'll move to Alex Weinreb. Shmuel, what's the bottom line? What's the main takeaway for you?
Well, the bottom line that Israel is a very young society and still in flux, and things are going to change in Israel. Israel is not going to stay the same. And when we see such processes, it is very important to separate the signal from the noise. There's a lot of noise associated with Knesset members, proposing preposterous legislation and all kinds of things that make people scared. But ultimately, when you look at Israel back in the 70s, when I was growing up in Israel, and you look at Israel today, Israel in many ways is much more liberal today than what it used to be. Everything is open on Shabbat, on the Saturday. People are walking around with tattoos and with very immodest type of clothes. It's not as if Israel became a place in which being religious and being strict is the new norm, and you can no longer have nice coffee on a Saturday morning. If anything happened, it's the opposite. Israel is more open today than ever. On the other hand, there is, we are in a race. It's a race between a culture that is becoming more open and a culture that is becoming more traditional. It is a race between certain communities having more children, but then certain communities shifting or moving away from religiosity to secularity. Everything is a race, and I hope it's not a race to the bottom. There are some warning signs that we should address, some of them even urgently, but I don't think that it's already time in which to just wave our hands in despair and say, well, this country is doomed. It's going to be an Iranian theocracy. I think we're pretty far from that. And I would not get overexcited again because of, we live in a society in which provocation makes headlines. Provocation is oftentimes just provocation that should not be treated seriously. And if we look at actualities and facts rather than professions of doom or provocation, I think we can become somewhat more calm about the future of Israel.
All righty. Gila, are you buying into this? What's the takeaway? Are you feeling less concerned, less anxious about that, or?
I am afraid that not at all. So I'm sorry. Maybe the difference is that being a legal scholar, and following democratic backsliding and the rise of populism, around the world in a comparative, constitutional comparative perspective, I'm too closely aware of the way that political power is translated into control. Okay, so it's the race that Shmuel is talking about. I agree that it's a race between tradition and modernity, whatever, or the race between Alex was mentioning a trickle down, but in the race between the trickle down and the political power will always win. So in order for trickle down to succeed, it's going to be the situation has to be much better, to begin with than it is in Israel today. And again, it's not just Israel; it's all around the world. If Trump has not been elected, Netanyahu would have done things completely differently. I mean, his chances of getting away with what he's getting away would have been much less, pronounced, and we see that constantly. So I think it's we're talking here about religiosity, but we have to understand that it's not just private religiosity that we are talking about. We're talking about using religiosity and a very certain kind of religiosity to run the state. And this type of thing is happening again, not just in Israel. It's also happening in the United States, and it has a very set order of things. There's a legal way. There are legal, instruments that do that, and the plan works. You see, Orban in Hungary was the first one who did it. He made the blueprint, and the blueprint worked there, and the blueprint is working in the United States, and the blueprint is working in Israel, and everything we see around it, all the increased religiosity, it's just that the war has only made everything work faster and better for Netanyahu. This is why we're at war again. Surprise, surprise. So we have to, I don't know, I think we have to be much more realistic about the bigger picture if we want to understand, our chances of changing it.
All righty, thank you so much. Alex Weinreb, final thoughts. What's your takeaway?
Well, I'm certainly, I think one of the biggest things we have to confront in Israel is firstly the growing Haredi population, especially given the fact that they, after so much effort to try to get Haredi men to work, it's hardly working. Meaning it's been quite a failure. Haredi parties, again, they reflect that. So I think that's something which we need to deal with. At some point earlier, you asked a question, what can be done? You asked it of Gila, and the immediate thing which jumped to mind, if you pardon my French, was somebody needs to grow some balls, and meaning that there is not yet the courage to confront the Haredi leadership with more coercive measures to deny them support. Even though the Supreme Court has said we need to do it, it hasn't happened. And until there's some support for that from Parliament, then I don't see things changing, because the Haredi leadership has specific goals, and those run counter to, I think, what the national goals are. So that may be a big challenge, and I think it is surmountable. And one of the reasons I believe it's surmountable, and this will be my ending thought, is more positive. I have a different conception of power to Gila. Like she's focused on power as an instrument of the state. I believe much more that there is a counterpower in terms of what people do. And again, in population sciences, in demography, that's something we all know. Countries around the world are dealing with a problem of low fertility, meaning for them it's a problem. They think there are too few children being born. They've been trying for years to try to get people to have more kids. Their plans are not working. It doesn't matter how much money they throw at it. They can't convince people to do it. People are pushing back. And I think some sort of model like that. So I mentioned my daughter, what she's doing. There are for every action there is a reaction, and that's as true socially as it is in the world of physics. So as much as the state is putting 500 million shekel into trying to educate people for Jewish pride, that is going to have a counter effect. So my passing thought is maybe because I'm fundamentally optimistic, and I believe fundamentally that Israel is a liberal society, meaning internally in the minds of a vast majority of people here, they want to live in a more pluralistic society. So I don't believe that even if crazy laws pass in the Knesset, I think there'll be pushback in terms of what people do, and eventually it'll also be changed in the Knesset.
All righty. Thank you so much for your insights, for your thoughts. We kind of extended the event a bit longer, but I think it was worth it because the conversations were very lively. Thank you so much, Shmuel Rosner, Gila Stopler, my apologies, and Alex Weinreb. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us. Just once again to remind you that our next in-person event will actually take place on campus on March 24th at 7 p.m. at the Clarice Smith Performing Arts Center. This will be the inauguration of the Gildenhorn Family Lecture Series featuring Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, who will talk about U.S.-Israel relations in a changing Middle East. Please stay safe in Israel and elsewhere. I hope that this conflict will come to a quick and conclusive resolution to allow everybody to return to their routines or normalcy, so to speak. Thank you so much once again, Shmuel Rosner, Gila Stopler, and Alex Weinreb. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, you all.
Thank you very much.
Take care.